What is going on YouTube? Today we are reacting to Hitler's plan for the world if we won. This is from the infographic show. Go look them on YouTube, watch their videos, and let's jump right into this.
Adolf Hitler stands on a podium to great applause. His chaotic mind is racing as the crowd screams out Heil Hitler. A crowd made up of not just Germans but various nationalities that have fallen under his evil spell. The superpower of Germany is untouchable. There's no such thing as the Soviet Union anymore. The great of Great Britain is lying in the mud. Millions are being executed while millions more are enslaved in Hitler's labor camps. There's just one more thing to accomplish, and that's annihilating the USA, to subdue what Hitler regards as a low-down, dirty race of mongrels. He has won, and it's hell on earth for many. We'll get around to this standoff with the USA, but first we need to know how Hitler pulled it off, this unbelievable victory in Europe.
Do you think that Hitler could have actually won the war? That's a question that I actually think about a lot when I think about it, because when you learn about Hitler in history, they teach you and they're like that Hitler was winning. Besides when America entered from the bombing of Pearl Harbor and we entered and liberated France, Hitler was winning. And I think Hitler's blunder in the world, and this is not saying that Hitler should have won the war, nor should anybody help him win the war, nor should he be justified for anything that he's doing, but I'm simply saying that Hitler's blunder was his retaliation to Russia, because neither of the world's superpowers, of course, Germany was a superpower at the time. Neither of today's most known superpowers, they weren't really in the war. So America was supplying the Allies, and I'm not gonna say that I know it. I'm gonna say it's speculation because I don't know the facts. But America was also funding some sort of war between Japan and China, but I don't know about that, so I'm not going to comment on it. But the two superpowers weren't in the battle, to say. They were funding the battle, but they weren't in the battle. Of course, war is a money's game, and a lot of people use that to make money, as we're probably seeing, right now. But so when Hitler and Russia, they weren't against each other originally. Hitler and Russia had a neutral standing, but Hitler decided that he was getting way too egotistical, which he already was, but he decided he was going to try to overtake Russia, and he wanted, or the Soviet Union then, and he wanted to try to, get into that so he could have global domination. Yeah, that's where his blunder started. So once Russia entered into the war, they were wiped. Everybody says that it was all, America, which America did have a very big part in, but dude, it was both America and Russia, but I'd say it leans more onto the Russian side, besides America creating the atomic bombs. If Hitler would have gotten to the point to where he never tried to go against Russia and stayed neutral with them, I think that eventually our atomic bombs wouldn't have went towards Japan. They probably would have went towards Germany to try to eradicate Hitler, but that would have caused more casualties. So I don't really know. But let's keep reacting.
Here we mix reality with fiction. As you know, at the start of the Second World War in 1939, Hitler's army, the Wehrmacht, devastated Poland. With its legion of panzer tanks and an incredibly efficient mobile infantry, the Poles were no match for the Germans. The attack was like lightning, which is what the word blitzkrieg was derived from. In September, German bombs were dropped on the town of Luck, not just destroying buildings, but even killing kids on their way to school. This sent a message of what was to come. The Polish pilot B.J. Solak noted, "The stench of burning and a brown veil of smoke filled the air all around our town. No one was spared." The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, rained hellfire down on Poland. Trains were seen derailed from the tracks. Kids screamed at the sight of the dead. It was a terror no one could have expected. And so on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Amazingly, France was beaten in just 6 weeks, and in time, something worrying occurred. Surprisingly, most of the French accepted the new Vichy government, one sympathetic to Nazi ideology. Not many know that a large number of people in France endorsed Hitler's hatred toward the Jews. Bear this in mind as we go through this story today. But by that time, Denmark, Norway...
Wow. I didn't know that either. I didn't know that France actually kind of sided with Hitler. I didn't know that. Or not sided with him, but sided with hating Jews. A lot of countries don't like Jews either, which, I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to say anything on the topic because I don't know. But a lot of countries really don't. And that's why they speak up on like Jewish hate. I don't think you should hate Jews. Like, don't hate the Jewish people. And I mean, a lot of people nowadays say like to hate, or they try to spread the hate of Jews through saying like, oh well, it's they're controlling the government, they're controlling America, and they're controlling the wars and stuff. And like, I don't know how much of true that is. I'm not gonna like, I don't know how true that is, but I don't believe Jewish people are doing that. I believe that it is the people in power that are doing that. Anybody, not just Jews. Anyone who's in specific seat of power. But that's just my take on it. Like, I don't think you should just hate a specific group of people just because some people hate them.
Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg had already been beaten by the Germans. It was as if the German soldiers were on steroids, which isn't far from the truth in the view of their heavy use of powerful methamphetamine, Pervitin. And
did you know that that is how methamphetamine was created? I did not know that. I learned about that when we started talking about it in school. I did not know that Hitler practically created meth. It's actually kind of cool to get into because he wanted like super soldiers, and then he created meth, and then that spread it to the United States and created a big drug outbreak. It's
with Norway
crazy.
defeated, Hitler now had access to heavy water,
Turn down a little
although
bit, so it's
not known
like
at the time.
loud.
This is a key ingredient in the creation of the nuclear bomb. This was bad news. When
Really?
France fell and the British were left scurrying for their lives on the escape from Dunkirk, it looked as though the Germans were totally invincible. These conquests so far meant tens of thousands of Germans killed and many more injured. France itself had lost 50,000 men in the invasion, Britain lost 11,000, but now Germany had a massive 1.5 million prisoners of war. It would have been much worse had the Brits not had their miracle at Dunkirk. Britain was at this point waiting for the Battle of Britain. It was a frightening thing to imagine. Not many people thought this small island nation could hold its own. But the fighting spirit still burned within Britain. As a wounded British soldier named Paul Ritchie said when he was flown back to England from France, he couldn't imagine his country going the same way France had. In his own words, he said, "With my mind still filled with the blast and flame that had shattered France, I was seized with utter disgust at the smug contentedness enjoyed behind the sea barrier. Still, he worried about what was around the corner." On June 18, 1940, Winston Churchill spoke at the House of Commons. In his impeccable oratory style, he said, "I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life." He was probably right. Churchill went on, "Hitler knows he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age." He said that upon the defeat of Germany, men will say that this was their finest hour. And take note, he said Hitler would go after the USA. It was just a matter of time, according to this cigar-munching elitist who admittedly was drunk and drugged up half the time.
Yeah, I don't know. Would our government really go against Hitler, though, is my question. Would they? At the time. Maybe. I don't know. Because we weren't, that's the thing, we were more neutral. I mean, we were neutral-leaning allies. We didn't like, fully join the Allies until after Pearl Harbor. Which, you can have your conspiracies and stuff, but I'm only going to be speaking on the facts that we know. But I don't know. I really don't know if that would have went the way that we're claiming.
Still, he correctly envisioned the hell that Hitler would unleash. That's why Churchill was so against settling with Hitler. He was sure that at some point the furious Fuhrer would have Britain in shackles and take over his empire. Hitler would not stop, not until Nazi ideology pervaded the globe. The Battle of Britain commenced. In the skies, British Hawker Hurricanes and Spitfires fought it out with German Messerschmitt Bf 109s. The so-called dogfights were crazy, and many young pilots who went up did not come back down. Alive, anyway. Here is how one Spitfire pilot described a day at work. "We were both flying in a tight circle, just a little more and I'll have him. Pressing the trigger, I waited expectantly for the 109 to explode. I've hit his wing. He was one of the lucky ones. Life expectancy for an RAF pilot during the war was a grim thing indeed. 60% of operational airmen died, were injured, or became prisoners of war. Around 51% of all RAF aircrew died. Bombs from German Junkers rained down on strategic locations in England, with sirens blaring on a regular basis during what the Brits called the Blitz. It went on for 8 months. But the British down below were typically amenable to hardships. One woman wrote in her diary, "I wonder what the pilots feel. After all, somebody loves them even if they're Nazis." At some point, Hitler made the mistake of withdrawing aircraft for Russia's planned invasion in May 1941. That really was a mistake. It turned out the Germans lacked a cogent strategic plan. The planes also often missed their targets, and British scientists were good at reading German signals and jamming their radars. The British public showed fortitude too. A woman named Barbara Dixon wrote that she'd never even heard of Poland, but she'd do anything to repel the beast of Hitler, who she said was trying to blow us up or murder us in our beds. Historians say attacking Britain was one of the great blunders Germany made in the war, with the next one being the invasion of the Soviet Union. Had Hitler focused all his strength on Britain and not at one point said, "Okay, we'll come back for you later," the Brits might have settled with Germany. Many people in Britain wanted that. They didn't think Hitler was as crazy as he turned out to be. Hitler had many times expressed
Wait,
Britain
they
wanted
wanted what?
said, "Okay, we'll come back for you later." The Brits might have settled with Germany.
Oh.
Many people in Britain wanted that. They didn't think Hitler was as crazy as he turned out to be. Hitler had many times expressed his liking for British culture, and he said, unlike those mongrels in America, Britain had a good Aryan culture. Prior to German propagandists criticizing the British for their empire's atrocities and their plutocrats living like kings while the working class lived in the slums, Hitler had some pretty good
The
relations
British
with certain
wanted
British
Hitler to
politicians.
take over
Britain's
Britain,
army was
or-
nothing compared to
I
the
don't
German army, and no one really expected them to hold their own in the skies. Even the US ambassador in London, Joseph Kennedy, said Britain had no chance. Despite 23,000 civilians dying and around 33,000 injured, with the German retreat, confidence was bolstered. It's thought 1,000 RAF planes were shot down, with about 544 fighter command pilots losing their lives. Then, with bombers and Coastal Guard losses, that added up to 1,542 planes lost and another 1,542 lives lost. The German Luftwaffe lost around 1,800 planes, and more than 2,500 pilots were killed. Across the pond, an American
And
journalist
no
wrote
German
Adolf Hitler met his
civilians, 'cause
first
it
defeat
never
in 8
actually
years,
touched
in what might go
Germany
down in
until later.
history as a battle as important as Waterloo or Gettysburg. Winston Churchill uttered those now famous words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." This bolstered confidence in the US too, and elsewhere in the
field
world.
of
Germany wasn't invincible. It sent a strong message, and for Britain at the
I'm trying to
time,
pay
having the most
attention,
powerful
'cause
navy in the world, it
I
knew
want to
no
add
Germans would be
commentary, but
walking down
not
its streets
also
anytime
pay
soon.
attention.
But as we said, Hitler planned to come back for Britain just as soon as he'd taken care of other matters, namely the Soviet Union. The reason we spent some time on this matter is that had Britain been soundly beaten and backed down, the whole outcome of the war would have been different. With Britain out of the
Really?
war, Germany could have focused less time on one very formidable foe in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa. It would have also sent a strong message to the Soviet Union and to the United States. Remember,
Really?
the US didn't want to get involved in a bloody European war. US citizens didn't want their young men being shot to pieces far from its now incredibly industrious shores.
Really? Are we sure? Because, I mean, I could agree with the statement, but in World War II, a lot of people were lying about their age so they can go to war because they thought it was fun. Then they quickly learned that it's not fun.
But in our alternative universe, let's say Germany did succeed in having air superiority over Britain. Germany might have launched Operation Sea Lion, the planned land invasion of Britain. This was not Hitler's first choice. He had been hoping for the British to accept his offer to back down out of the war. This is what Hitler had said he needed to happen for that invasion to be successful. First, he said the RAF had to be beaten down in its morale, and in fact that it can no longer display any appreciable aggressive force in opposition to the German crossing. Then he hoped the English Channel would be swept of mines, and if the British Navy was distracted with fighting in the North Sea and the Mediterranean, it would make crossing the Channel into England more achievable. Apparently, even Hitler's inner circle wasn't keen on this idea, and if you read the writings of contemporary historians, most will tell you he would have failed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt suspected Hitler
Really?
was just trying to bluff Britain into pulling out of the war. He said, "By God, even Napoleon failed to invade Britain." The place was a veritable fortress. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was no match for the British Navy. It ruled the waves, and it had done so for years. But in our scenario, Britain lost in the air. The morale of the military and the public was very low. The British Navy, as Hitler wanted, was spread out. The German Navy fought remarkably, better than expected, and before you could say Schadenfreude, the powerful British elites were foreseeing losing their empire while watching panzer tanks make a mess of that beautiful British grass. The country soon surrendered, just as France had. Now Britain was finished. Hitler could certainly win the war. With France and Britain subdued, and to our modern shame, many people in both countries were now buying into Hitler's Aryan rubbish. The Germans can now go full throttle at the
Wait,
Soviet
have we
Union.
hit the?
Okay,
have
back
we hit
to
the?
real life.
I can't tell.
Hitler had
I cannot tell if we've hit the part where it goes from for real history into the hypothetical. Did I feel ashamed to have to actually look this up? Let me pull out Google. Oh wait, I'm on Google. Let me create a separate tab here. Did Hitler invade Britain? No, Hitler never invaded or occupied England, while Nazi Germany planned a full-scale invasion in 1940 known as Operation Sea Lion, which is what they're talking about. It was postponed indefinitely in September of 1940 after the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air support superiority in the Battle of Britain and failed to secure the English Channel. So I'm
made a
guessing we put the
non-aggression pact
hypothetical
with another tyrant, Joseph Stalin, but then he invaded Russia anyway. Never trust the word of a tyrant. The German army, full of confidence, was sure it would walk through Russia. They also said they were doing the right thing. As this 18-year-old German soldier named Henry Mettelman said, I accept it as natural that it was German duty for the good of humanity to impose our way of life on lower races and nations, who probably, because of their limited intelligence, would not quite understand what we were on about. Hitler hated Jews, but he was no fan of Slavs either. His notion that most Germans were pure Aryans was utter ridiculous, given centuries of the intermixing of people in Northern Europe. It was ridiculous, full stop. But even so, he was prepared to annihilate Slavish people. As for communists, once he'd won the war in Russia...
Racism's so stupid, dude. I never really understand it neither. How to actually hate somebody for, like, how they look or where they came from, even though, like, most of us come from a mix of all of it. And, I mean, of course, the people living in America now, well, I guess I should say, because I'm talking more towards white people. I mean, anybody could be racist because it's just the oppression, or not necessarily the oppression, but just the prejudice towards one race. So anybody can be prejudiced towards a race. So anybody can be racist. But I think I'm talking more about white people when I say most white people living in America now are mostly from Europe. But that doesn't mean that they don't have intertwinings from other parts of the world. Like eventually somewhere down the line, you know, you have all sorts of DNA that, I mean, not now since, you know, genetics fall off, but I just never understand racism because they're prejudiced towards one race group because for some reason in their brain that think that they are better and that they want to feel superiority towards another race, even though in the end goal, it doesn't matter because one person's not better than the other. So what's the point in being like, what do you gain from racism besides, you know, looking like an idiot? I don't know. I'll never understand it.
They would either have to forfeit their ideology or die. The many millions of Jews in the Soviet Union would be hunted down and killed. As General Erich Heppner said, the war with Russia is a vital part of the German people's existence. It is the old fight of German against the Slav, the defense of the European culture against the Muscovite Asiatic flood, and the repulse of Jewish Bolshevism. So mark our words, the people of the Soviet Union would have been spared no quarter, or at least those that fit into Hitler described as the lower races. And while Joseph Stalin, by the time he died, had the blood of tens of millions of peoples on his paranoid hands, his zero tolerance to people...
Just from communism, by the way. Just from communism. Just from imposing communism into Russia. He killed a lot of people.
Not fighting was one reason why Germany couldn't defeat him. The Soviets killed around 300,000 of their own soldiers.
I never really read out much on
fighting
Stalin.
badly or going AWOL. People starved because of Stalin's focus on building weaponry above feeding his people. People even changed sides because they detested Stalin so much. But if he hadn't been so bloody despotic, Germany might well have won. For the invasion, Operation Barbarossa, Hitler deployed
And
around
that's what I was
3.6 million
saying
troops,
earlier.
2,700 aircraft, and 3,600 tanks, which was record-breaking in terms of European warfare. Stalin had 2.9 million troops, 8,000 aircraft, and 11,000 tanks, but the Germans were superior in terms of technology and general warfare. But let's think. If Germany had just defeated Britain in our fictional scenario, there would be a spring in the
Yep, it
military
was
step.
fictional.
They'd also be making use of that excellent British arms industry.
All right, that
For
makes me feel
instance,
like
in
an
real
idiot
life,
now.
Hitler had thousands of French prisoners of war slaving away in its munitions industry, plus around 650,000 French civilian laborers, not to mention the Vichy French fighting for Germany. Over in the USA, in real life again, many people didn't have much love for the Soviets. The famed American aviator Charles Lindbergh said at the time, "I would 100 times rather see my country ally herself with Britain or even Germany with all her faults than the cruelty and godlessness."
Yeah, and this is why the battle between capitalism and communism is stupid, and why the Cold War was stupid, because it forced the children of that time and the people of that time becoming so paranoid over communism, because our government beating it into their heads that communism was bad, that America would rather ally with any other type of group of people, including Hitler, over communism. Which, I mean, I'm not saying communism's good, and I'm not saying the communist leaders of that time were good, and the communist leaders now are good. I'm not saying any of it's good, but it's the fact that you've practically brainwashed the people of that time to be so scared of this just one economical way of living, good or bad, that now they would rather choose anything that even arguably worse just so they can avoid that. And I think that's stupid. And that, as Gen Z grows up, my generation, we're more focused towards equality for all, and just trying to sway away from that stuff, or that's what I like to believe.
The barbarism of the Soviet Union. There was more support for Nazism in the US than you might think. Hence, Philip
That's
Roth's
insane.
alternative reality novel, The Plot Against America. The famed industrialist Henry Ford admired Nazi Germany, and he was for much of his life very much anti-Semitic, showcased in the anti-Semite books he published with titles such as The International Jew, The World's Foremost Problem. Back
That's
to our alternate
surprising.
reality.
I mean, it's not
If the British
all right. It's not surprising. I have heard stuff about Henry Ford and him being a Nazi and supporting Nazism at that time. But it's crazy to know that there was so many people fighting towards being more anti-Semitic and more like a Nazi than there were people trying to be a communist. Even though I would say, what was Germany? What was Hitler's economical way of living? A lot of people say it's more socialist, but did he have capitalism? I don't think he did. No, he didn't have capitalism. What was Nazi Germany's economic system? There we go. Nazi Germany's economic system was a hybrid, centrally planned war. It was a centrally planned war economy that maintained private property and profit, but subject them to strict state control, so communism, often described as diarist or command economy under capitalist forms. It prioritized rapid rearmament and autarky, self-sufficient, over consumer welfare, driven by state-directed investments and massive deficit financing. So, North Korea. That's what I'm picking up from this, is that it was a hybrid of a war economy and a strict state control. But I don't know. North Korea is not really a war economy because they're not really in wars right now. They've only been in one. And the one war they were in was when North Korea was kind of founded. Or split from Korea. It's more it's more communist, I'd guess. I'd guess it seemed to be more communist with capitalist aspects, is what I would say. And that's what I'm talking about. We have people so scared of communism that they'd rather be a Nazi, even though Nazi was borderline communism. And I could be totally wrong. Tell me if I'm wrong. If I'm totally wrong about the economic system for Nazi Germany, but I think it was leading more communist.
And the USA hardly coming to the rescue. There is every chance that Germany could have won Russia, especially if its ally, for the short term anyway, was Japan, who would also attack Russia. Just think, with Britain defeated, Japan wouldn't have to fight the country in Singapore, Hong Kong, and what were the Malaya and Burma. We also have to remember about the impact of all the countries of the British Empire that fought alongside Britain. Think about British India and the massive impact it had on the war, or India alone, whose 2.5 million troops fought under British command. Think about Canada, which couldn't have fought on since it was a dominion of the British Empire, or even Australia, who, although they didn't join the war effort right away, still provided the Brits with manpower and resources. We understand this is overly simplistic, and we haven't even discussed any country's atomic bomb research, but let's just say after Britain fell, the invasion of Russia went as Hitler planned. It was over within the year. This really could have happened had things just been a bit different. What would the USA be thinking now after much of Europe and some of Asia had fallen to Adolf Hitler and Japan? As we said, Americans didn't want to fight a European war. William Kaplan, the then head of Harvard, said as much.
Honestly, I think if it came down to Hitler was attacking America, and America had to choose whether or not it wants to fight back and retaliate or submit, I think America would fall into a civil war. And that you would have a split between people thinking that you have one side wanting to join the anti-Semitism, or however you say it, you know? They wanted to be anti-Semitic because, you know, a lot of people were racist at that time. The Civil Rights Act ain't even close to being passed right now. So I think a lot more people would join it for the fact that Hitler was racist. So they'd be like, I'm racist too, so I want to be a part of this. But would also fail to see how it would affect them in the moment. But you'd also have the side of people who understand that and can free think for themselves. And then it would fall down to a civil war. But ultimately, it would be our government's decision. So
one time stating, Hitler's going to win, let's be friends with him. Many people thought this way, of course. They weren't fully aware of Hitler's plans for world domination and the sheer ugliness of what he was capable of. Still, the U.S. had meddled in the war by freezing assets and preventing Japan from getting the oil it needed to attempt to build its empire during the war. And Japan didn't much like this American interference. The U.S. wasn't totally out of the war, lending weapons to Britain and helping in other ways, all for a price, of course. But then companies such as GM, Ford, and IBM also sold what was described as useful war materials to Germany. The U.S. made hay while bombs spilled down on Europe, coming out of the war much richer. It might have stayed that way if Japan hadn't launched the famous attack. Japan had hoped that after attacking the U.S. Pacific Fleet...
Do we think it was money farming? From how it sounds and from how a lot of the governments were thinking during this time, do we think it was money farming? Not sure. Because I like to believe that it wasn't money farming, and I don't want to say that it was just all governments trying to get out of a depression that they were in at that time. But when you start hearing how different governments were talking during this time, it sounds like they were just money farming. Like we're part of those, like those short films that you see.
At Pearl Harbor, the U.S. would revert to its isolationist policies. In our alternate reality, the U.S. had watched on as Germany's Operation Barbarossa was successful and Britain and France were a spent force. In this case, had the Pearl Harbor attack happened, the U.S. might well not have retaliated. But then, had history been different, the U.S. might not have interfered one bit and the attack on Pearl Harbor wouldn't have happened in the first place. And that's how things are different in our alternate world. So, right now, Hitler's over the moon. The problem is he has enemies everywhere in his vanquished countries. This is why he's sending out death squads to
for like
hunt down the South. The Operation Barbarossa was successful, and Britain and France were a spent force. In this case, had the Pearl Harbor attack happened, the U.S. might well not have retaliated. But then, had history been different, the US might not have interfered one bit and the attack on Pearl Harbor wouldn't have happened in the first place. And that's how things are.
So he's saying that we're in fiction now. So he's saying we've taken over Britain, and after taking over, I mean, not we, Germany's taken over Britain. And so since they took over Britain and they had this big freaking factory going on, that they no longer need to worry about America. Wait, okay. Now that I'm thinking, is everything he's saying about how America was feeling at the time fiction as well? Because I could be very wrong again and not being able to tell that he is being fictionate. I'm actually so gullible. Let's just
different in our alternate world. So, right now, Hitler's over the moon. The problem is he has enemies everywhere in his vanquished countries. This is why he's sending out death squads to hunt down the people he doesn't like. For this, he deploys mobile death squads, aka the Einsatzgruppen. They scour German-occupied Europe looking for their victims, and that includes the Jewish people, communists, gypsies, anti-fascists, and even intellectuals. Hitler didn't leave all the work to his death squad, though. Gypsies,
Wait. So Germany were looking for, I mean, obviously Jewish people. Communist. Huh. Might be wrong.
Fascists and even intellectuals. Hitler didn't leave all the work to his death squad, though. He prepared a list in 1940 of what he perceived to be dangerous Brits, kept in his black book. He is very well aware that he is much despised by a lot of people in occupied Britain. The French had a resistance, but it was small and only really significant close to the end of the war. Still, there would have been resistance in Britain too. This black book contained 2,820 names, from Jews to journalists to anti-fascists to spies to politicians to academics and novelists, all to be immediately arrested once Britain was successfully invaded. This book can give you some idea about what would have happened if Hitler had won the war. There are some names in the book that would surprise you, including the great writer Aldous Huxley. If Hitler had won in England, the writer of the book Brave New World might not have had the chance in 1949 to congratulate George Orwell on his dystopian novel 1984. We very much doubt he would have written to Orwell saying, within the next generation.
That's an actually good book with a good story. Now, have I actually read that book? No. But have I heard about that book and heard about its story? Yes. So I'm going to say it's a good book from what I've heard on it, because I practically know the plot. But I don't like reading.
I believe that the world's leaders will discover that infant conditioning is more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, by flogging them and kicking them into obedience. He was right, as it turned out in the long run. Anyway, Hitler was doing a lot of flogging and kicking in the UK, and perhaps Huxley, as well as other British intellectuals who liked the idea of freedom, would have been sent to Nazi extermination camps. These Brits had no idea they were on Hitler's hit list. With the playwright Noel Coward writing after the war, if anyone had told me at the time that I was high up on the Nazi blacklist, I should have laughed and told them not to talk nonsense. For the most part, no one really understood what Hitler would do to secure his vision of a Nazi-led utopia. In Britain as well as in the Soviet Union, Jews, gypsies, communists, certain kinds of intellectuals are sent to labor camps to work or die in the process. Young and fit people in Britain, as well as Russia, would be drafted to work for the Nazi war machine and its general industry.
But maybe he wanted to target communists because his, I guess, way with Russia. Because if we're in fiction, then he's kind of like at the bat with Russia. Like he didn't go to try to overtake Russia at this time. So maybe he's just targeting communists because he doesn't like Russia, just kind of has like spite, even though I think his economic system was more communist than it was anything else.
This machine has to expand. After all, Hitler has the USA in his sights. The country now wondering if Churchill had been right and if they should have helped out earlier when Germany was more vulnerable. Meanwhile, Britain adopts a new government in line with the Nazi regime. That is, an authoritarian, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic government led by Oswald Mosley, whose British Union of Fascists had just been resurrected after being disbanded in 1940. Not too many years earlier, Hitler had kept a keen eye on Mosley, impressed when he said things such as, "For the first time I openly and publicly challenged the Jewish interests of this country, commanding commerce, commanding the press, commanding the cinema, dominating the city of London, killing industry with their sweatshops." And now with Hitler at the helm and his man Mosley in England, The German propaganda machine goes into hyperdrive. What's astounding is how quickly many people in Britain embrace what Mosley is saying. He promises an end to corrupt banking, telling them the upper classes have kept them in bondage for centuries. Soon thugs like the old king and church mobs squash any resistance to the British fascists. People are afraid to speak out against fascism. Progressives are hunted down, and something similar is happening in Russia. The Russian Fascist Party has never been that big. But now with Stalin and almost all of the Politburo exterminated or in labor camps, and with the Germans releasing many thousands of Soviet prisoners from gulags, a lot of people start to believe the Nazi propaganda. Millions had died under Stalin. Millions more had been on the verge of starvation or been sent to gulags, and generally lived in fear. That's why it doesn't take long for these deeply oppressed people to embrace another form of government, one that promises a better society. As time goes on, while Germany focuses much of its efforts on industry and taking back the African colonies that had been taken away after the First World War, something strange is happening in the USA. The German propaganda machine under Joseph Goebbels is incredibly effective, even far away in the US. The mass exterminations have been kept away from the world's eyes for the most part. Despite the rumors and in spite of the spying, the US public doesn't know about those wicked massacres of innocent people. So now the Nazis spew out propaganda regarding how their New World Order is rescuing people from out-of-control capitalist slavery and releasing them from the chains that they say the Jewish elite have placed on them. A worrying number of people are taking interest in the fascist.
You see, this is why people worry about a World War III. Because just as he's talking right now, I feel like that sentence alone of a lot of Americans would probably sway more towards Germany because they feel like they could get liberation from the capitalism that's set on them from the Jews. That sentence today to certain Americans could trigger something bad, like very bad, because it is insane how recently if you get on TikTok, and I hate it when it does this, but when TikTok can get super like super political, or I don't even know what to call it, like freaking Metal Gear political type crap, bro. Like they're trying to be ultra political. And you start seeing crap where people are talking about Jews, and then you see all the people in the comments, and they're like, I really side with the mustache man now. You should never be able to justify what he did. And people are trying to now. And it's crazy. You should never be able to look at what he's done and what his beliefs were and say they were good or for a good reformation. Because a lot of people think that he was doing it because he could see underneath the Jewish mask, whatever that's supposed to mean. They are wrong. He wasn't doing it because he was trying to liberate somebody. He was doing it because he hated them. And he started doing it because he hated them. He believed that they didn't do anything in World War I. They were practically selling Germany to the war and blamed them for Germany's debt at the time, and used that as a way to grow into power and become who he was at that certain point in time. And people trying to not only justify that, but justify anybody else who spreads hate is absurd.
Movement in the US. Remember, this is a country where a massive part of the poorer population has just gone through absolute hell during the Great Depression. Hitler blames all that on the Jews. And when leading fascism supporters in the US talk, some of the American people listen, as they also do over the border where the Canadian Union of Fascists speaks at events. Then when Charles Lindbergh stands up and promotes his America First policy, pro-fascist isolationists in the crowd cheer. These crowds just keep growing, and anti-Semitic sentiment grows with it. Even though the USA is already backward when it comes to civil rights compared to other advanced nations, racism becomes even more intense throughout the nation. The fascists in the US say leave Europe to its own devices. They say any form of intervention in European affairs will likely be disastrous given the now great power of Germany. People look up to Lindbergh when he says things like this. A few far-sighted Jewish people realize this and stand opposed to intervention, but the majority still do not. Their greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. Remember the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Flying Cross, but now the Nazis have also given him a medal namely the Commander Cross of the Order of the German Eagle. The Nazis know that Lindbergh and Ford, two of the most powerful men in America, often discuss what they and the Nazis call the Jewish problem. Perhaps Hitler thinks Germany doesn't need to attack the US at its borders. Perhaps he can take control from within the borders, with the help of an American fascist party working on his behalf. Hitler muses that it isn't as if this country of Mongols doesn't already have widespread white supremacy. America can quite easily be pushed over the edge, he assumes. Those he calls the mongrels will once again be enslaved and the Jewish will be executed. The racial segregation that already exists in the US will just be taken up a notch. Hitler once said that the US military posed no threat, but he has changed his mind as of late. Invading the US, he knows, is an almost impossible task, even though part of him believes the country's military is weak due to its racial diversity. He writes in his diary one day that he'd like nothing more than to see New York in flames. Japan has already been granted part of the former Soviet Union, and the country is certainly up for an invasion of the US. But will it work?
Yeah,
Months
I think
pass.
that threatening. Yeah, once you start threatening the city, once you start threatening the city and the country itself, the actual racist people who hate people for no reason would turn on you because their loyalty to the country is absurd, but their ability to be manipulated through siding with them with racism just for manipulation tactic is also insane. So I have actually no clue.
The year ticks over and the power of the Nazis just grows and grows. Now with so much European industry in its control, and an army like the world has never seen, the US is a David to the Goliath of Germany. And this is why the isolationists in the US win over so many of the people. War will mean mass death. It will mean certain defeat. Why not, just as so many have said in the past, be on good terms with Hitler? Do some trade with him. To become his enemy is a death sentence, and finance-wise, it makes no sense at all. Hitler contemplates on the costs of a long-distance invasion, but even with British ships now under his control, taking that many men across the sea is a Herculean task. Feeding those men, getting the fuel for the machines, moving all that equipment across the ocean just seems like a bridge too far. But if the Canadian fascists, who are now gaining popularity like the British fascists have, go for a war, a land invasion against the so-called decadent capitalists can happen overland from Canada. It will take time and the movement of many resources, not to mention it would also be very risky. Things aren't looking good for the US. Damn, think a lot of people. If the UK had only been able to repel Germany, none of this would have happened. That little island losing to the Nazis had changed the entire outcome of the history of the world. Then, one day Hitler's sitting at his desk and he receives a report that has taken months to compile. The report states that throughout Europe, an estimated 9.7 million Jews have been exterminated. It also states that 350,000 homosexuals have been killed, along with close to 840,000 Romani and Sinti people. Things have moved much faster since Europe was defeated by Hitler. The report doesn't state how many disabled people have died in the camps, although Hitler is pleased when he reads that they're being used for various medical experiments. People of color, says the report, as well as intellectuals, are mostly being employed in slave labor activities, although many have also been exterminated. Meanwhile, scientists working in the USA are making headway with an atomic bomb project. Little do they know that if they could have collaborated with scientists in Britain, the project would almost be complete. Now Hitler has control over Britain's project, seeing that under Mosley, Britain is nothing more than a German puppet state. It also helps that former King Edward VIII has been restored to the throne, a much more suitable monarch for the Nazis than George VI. But what about life in general in this new Europe? Hitler believes that he can create a utopian society, but it's only possible when the people he thinks have caused the world's problems are all dead, man, woman, and child. He hates religion, but in his new empire, he actually endorses religious tolerance. This is more out of fear of mass resistance than anything else. He also promotes selective polygamy, believing that if you mix the right genes, you will create
religious tolerance. Hitler believes in religion?
In his new empire, he actually endorses religious tolerance. This is more out of fear of mass resistance than anything else. He also promotes selective polygamy, believing that if you mix the right genes, you will create the right products for his army, for his science projects, for his idea of societal harmony. At times, this is oppressive for women, who are usually the ones selected. Strangely, for a man with so much blood on his hands, Hitler detests cruelty to animals and even endorses but not enforces national vegetarianism. At the same time, he...
What? Hitler was vegan? Hitler hated killing animals? Man, this guy's gonna hate it when he figures out humans are animals. That's a retarded joke. That's a stupid joke. But, I mean, I'm surprised. He wants to
abhors what he calls
enforce
degenerative
veganism.
art, and he hates the artists just as much, even if they do tick the right box for his so-called master race. He bans pornography in Germany as well as prostitution, some intellectual pursuits, he bans artists justism. At the same time, he abhors what he calls degenerative art, and he hates the artists just as much, even if they do tick the right box for his so-called master race. He bans pornography in Germany as well as prostitution, some intellectual pursuits, certain kinds of writing and poetry, decadent music, excessive boozing, and smoking. His puppet states are not asked to conform to these ideals, but in many cases, the new fascists around Europe espouse and enforce the ideals of the Nazis. In some ways, those who follow Hitler do see some benefits. Even some businesses and industries improve, since Hitler has taken a zero-tolerance stand against corruption. The totalitarian ways, he says, must be simple and without deceits. It is also horribly oppressive and leads to unhappiness that people try not to show. Just as one critic over in the US says, the utopia that Hitler seeks can never be free from tyranny. Anyone who says they don't like this new paradise will be severely punished. The guy who writes that is soon beaten up by one of the now widespread pro-fascist mobs in the US. The year is now 1944. For some time, British scientists have been working on an atomic bomb under the Tube Alloys Project, something that has been kept secret from everyone except those who need to know in Canada. The project was actually started before the USA's Manhattan Project. The Brits had forecast a bomb not being ready until 1947, but once the new German and Soviet scientists joined the project and the Germans have more facilities with the newly built heavy bombers and a hell of a lot more money to make bombs, the project is completed in 1944. But the US Manhattan Project is also just about ready. Little do the world's public know that a nightmare situation is taking place. In 1945, both sides...
If you set a totalitarian government that has taken over all of the world, why would you still need nuclear options? Why wouldn't you just need a efficient military that could wipe out a resistance? Because a resistance isn't going to beat military without having military to back that resistance, which is how we liberated France from storming and miraculously being able to overtake Normandy and work our way up into liberating France. And that all started with retaliation, which was in the French, which is why I think that I'm getting off topic. But I think, what is the point in having nuclear options if you own all of it? That's like, how do I put this? It's like if you were in a castle and you owned all of the castle, but you had different types of people living inside the castle. So you bring, and there's, okay, so that's a bad analogy, actually. Okay, so we're erasing the outside world and it's just the castle as the setting, because the outside world kind of kills the analogy. But you own a castle, outside world, doesn't matter. Everyone lives inside of this castle, and you bring a cannon inside the castle in case anyone disagrees with you. You're going to blow up half of your own property because they're retaliating, even though efficient guards would do the job.
Test their bombs, and so it is now known just how much destructiveness is in the hands of leaders, and more concerning in the hands of a man who thinks very start of the war had a huge stockpile of deadly sarin gas. So it's not so surprising that he doesn't like the thought of using an atomic bomb. As for the US, it was well aware of what's coming back if it drops a bomb. And why would it when Hitler has not yet made it clear he will invade the US? As crazy as Hitler is, he doesn't want to die. He doesn't want his idea of utopia to be destroyed. Still, if something doesn't change in the US, he might have to do something. This Cold War stalemate creates a frenzy among the public, especially the American public, that according to the polls, do not want to go to war with Hitler. It's during this next chaotic year that Lindbergh creates the American Fascist Party. to be sympathetic with Nazi ethos, but with an assurance from Hitler that Germany will not interfere in American affairs. So, how does Hitler finally win this war? It's when fascism wins in the
He is allowing Americans to live in a false sense of freedom. They are under fascism, but, quote, Hitler is going to stay out of their American affairs. Now, here is the catch. How is your totalitarian government figure going to, or more so, why would your totalitarian government figure stay out of your affairs just for your freedom? And boom, that's how you snag America, is by using false freedom or false hopes of freedom to completely
bitterness,
take over.
anger, and stupidity push people to polls to tick the box under American Fascist Party. Some of the poor just want change, and rightly so. But out of desperation, political distrust, and lack of options, they unwittingly choose their own demise. Lindbergh has assured that no Americans will be harmed in relation to their race or creed, but already an ugliness has seeped into a once hopeful culture. Gangs roam the streets at night, throwing Molotov cocktails through house windows. The police don't do much to stop it. This will only get worse. Families of Jewish people, African Americans, and other minorities, for that matter, huddle together.
Oh, yeah. Racism in America would be absolutely absurd. It'd probably boil down to almost, I wouldn't even give it a percentage. I'd say literally everyone you'd meet on the street that is white would be racist. If this were the case. Even out of fear, they would act racist. So they aren't seen as resisting, I guess you could say. Because, like, it's like those movies you see where it's like they don't want to be seen with that type of person because then it ruins their reputation, which in fascism would get them killed. It's very interesting to think about and to dive on that level, though. It would be horrible. I think it would be horrible for anybody who isn't white if that was the case. Like, honestly, if I was being 100% honest, people of color and other ethnicities would be almost extinct if this were to happen. Not only because a majority of them are dying and being murdered, but I feel like he would ban the procreation of other ethnicities and people of color, which is horrible. And actually, I'm very glad Hitler, not that I have never not been glad that he lost, or never that I've been, or yeah, I said it right. Never to not been glad that he lost. But it's actually insane to think of, like, if he would have won, how bad it would have been, not only for everyone in the world, but mostly for people of color and ethnic
in living
people.
rooms and shed tears when they watch Lindbergh throw his fist into the air on his victory. It is a victory for Hitler just as much. America closes its doors to the world, but also inside the house something is rotten. No structure can remain standing when the foundations are warped and decayed. Totalitarianism will eat itself and suppresses natural creativity, and with it, societal progress. It foments distrust and paranoia, and in that time leads to widespread violence and unhappiness. One day, goodness and morality and love and compassion among races will win out, and that rotten house will fall down. But for now, the present is Hitler's utopia, hell on earth.
And that's what I was saying.
Even for most of the ones who've asked.
That is what I was saying, is that even though you have this big evil, eventually it will come to where people do rise up against it, and it will start minuscule, because it can't last forever. Nothing can last forever. Everything has to eventually come to an end. No government or no type of, like, eventually America's government might come to an end. Now that might be 200, 300, 400 years from now due to how America's going right now. But I believe eventually, not through war and not through overthrowing, but through some deals, or like other places will become part of America or vice versa. It's just something to think about, really. I mean, like, it's all hypothetical, and it's really fun to get on hypotheticals that aren't debating hypotheticals, because debating hypotheticals aren't an argument. They're more of a test of morality. And when people use debating hypotheticals as a one-way ticket to win a debate against another, they're really losing that debate in the long term, because if you're only spamming hypotheticals, you're not making your point. You're just checking someone's morality. And 9 times out of 10, no matter how much you twist that hypothetical to bend to to make them bend out of their morality, the chances are they're going to stick in it. And they're just going to say whatever to get you to quit making hypotheticals because you can't debate. Now, you can have good debate tactics and still use hypotheticals. Hypotheticals are a good way to see if somebody is really believing what they say they're believing and not indoctrinated into that believing. It's a good way to separate it. But this was a good video, I'd say. Very good to like. It's very good to think about the hypotheticals and situations that would have occurred had of certain events taken place. And again, this is the infographic show. I've watched them in school a couple of times back when I was in school. They're very good to watch to get onto these hypotheticals, and they are way more popular than I am. So, I mean, it is a shout out to them, I guess, because this is their content, but they are way more popular than me. But W video, I'll see you guys in the next one.